Hello, this is Dr. Feast Price, and I will conclude our lecture by talking about narrative therapy that is used in a family therapy context. So, as we think of narrative therapy, it emerged in the late 1970s and 1980s, and so when you think about it, some of this particular therapeutic approach really hasn't been around an extremely long time. It's derived from postmodern theory, which postmodern theory gives family therapists the flexibility to recognize that some of the many problems that clients are faced with is based upon their specific worldview. And it helps to create an understanding that the world does not function in an absolute way, and it influences the ways therapists view, understand, and work with families. So basically, as a postmodern family therapist that's using narrative therapy, then basically what you're doing is understanding the problems or the issues that are presented by the family from their frame of reference and from their world views. So White and Epstein have been influenced by the postmodern movement within philosophy, anthropology, as well as psychology, and it speaks to the ways in which narrative therapy is used to work with family. And so some of the basic tenets of narrative family therapy is that it's focused on the relationship between experience and interpretation that is revealed in the narrative. So it's revealed in the ways in which people tell their story and explain their circumstances, how they arrive at meaning as it relates to their circumstances. Attention by the therapist should be paid to the way people tell their stories rather than the accuracy of the account of the story. So rather than paying attention to the details, which based upon some people might be determined as not factual, you're looking at the emotional connection that people have to the story. So how emotions are conveyed and the meaning that individuals give to their story, and the emotions that are connected to various parts or aspects of the story. So narrative family therapy involves it's highly respected for its values, which are in line with the rehabilitation profession that we all work in. It mobilizes the client to take personal responsibility. And when the client takes personal responsibility for their circumstances, it reduces the role and the amount of work by the therapist, but it also empowers the client to see their problems from the position where they can impact change. So due to the fact that the therapist is drawing out the client's story, it empowers the client because the narrative therapy believes that the client is the expert, and the therapeutic process is collaborative, which means that the plan is made by and for the client. So the goals of narrative therapy is to draw out stories that clients hold of themselves that prevent them from moving on. And in so doing, the primary mission here is to reshape the client's perceptions of themselves and their surroundings, thereby reshaping or changing their life narratives. So sometimes people can perceive themselves as being helpless or hopeless or nothing will change. And so it's helping to rechange people's narratives. And this therapeutic approach is very closely aligned with cognitive behavioral therapy because it focuses on the narratives. The narratives are linked to the way people think about their experiences, which thus impacts how they feel and how they behave. So if you think about narrative therapy and you think about how it interfaces with other therapeutic approaches, I would encourage you to pay particular attention to cognitive behavioral therapy And as we've discussed in a previous lecture or two, that therapeutic approaches has a lot of overlap, and there's much about these therapeutic approaches that is very consistent across approaches. So there are various ways of intervening with narrative therapy. And the first technique for intervening is the problem-saturated stories. And so it refers to the personal stories that the individuals express, which are based on their experiences. And these stories are characterized by problems, and clients only think of themselves in terms of these problems. So there's a limited extent to which clients are able to see themselves in ways other than the way they describe themselves in the narrative. And so the therapist has the responsibility of listening to what is communicated by the client and draw out specific language as it relates to the story. So effective listening skills is very important in narrative therapy. And so the second technique, which relates to the first, is mapping the problem's domain. And so after you've listened to the story, you map the problems out. So the therapist, along with the client, would discuss how the problem has affected various aspects of the client's lives or the family's lives. And in so doing, they are exploring different kinds of reciprocal patterns that become apparent and that are shown to have been supporting the problem. Additionally, scrutinizing the impact of the problem that the problem has had on their lives in all respects will serve as an eye-opening experience. So allowing them to better understand, scrutinize, and put a microscope or magnifying glass to some of the problems and the ways in which these problems have negatively impacted various areas or aspects of their lives, which proves beneficial. And the therapist has the role of asking for full detailed accounts of the effects that the problem has had. So once the understanding has occurred as a result of hearing the narrative, mapping the problem, then it's the third technique deals with the unique outcomes. And the client or clients are required to identify times in the past when the problem didn't exist. So if you think about this unique outcomes, it's really consistent with solution-focused therapy. Tell me about a time in your life that this problem didn't exist or when things were better. And this helps the client to explore alternative possibilities so that the person can see that their way of thinking does have alternative solutions. And so you're helping and assisting the client in creating new personal stories based on those unique occurrences. And it also reminds them that there were times that despite this problem, they were able to overcome it. And it also allows them to explore other possible alternatives. Another technique, which is the fourth technique, is externalizing the problem. And so a narrative therapist who works with the family would often encourage the family or clients, the persons within the family, to name the problem in order to further externalize the problem. Roth and Epstein believes that separating the person from the problem, it's called problem-saturated descriptions that have encompassed or have become their identities, is the means to help the client move forward. So externalizing the problem, rather than seeing the behavior as a problem, the person as the problem, see the behavior as the problem, and helping them to see that the person can in fact change the behavior and thus it will go away. So it's really just separating the person from the problem. And the spreading the news technique is where the client expresses their new personal narrative with other people. And so by telling other people of their new narrative, it reaffirms the new view or perspectives that are shared, and it also allows the spreading of the news of differences that gives a client a chance to recognize the changes that they've made, and this will allow family members to experience being heard by others. Telling others is very important. So just to restate spreading the news, it involves the client verbally reiterating changes noticed in the family members from the beginning of the session to now, and then having the family members to express their hopes and goals from now to the future and how they intend to affect the future. And not only are they taking this information and sharing it within the session, but they're also instructed to share this information with other persons that are important to them as a means of retelling their narrative. There is also the importance of incorporating a strengths-based approach. And a strengths-based approach is important because some family members may not want to be there. Also, it's useful in challenging their existing perceptions of themselves. It helps to encourage their perceptions and to live their attitudes. And Williams specifically believes that through drawing out the client's stories and meanings, narrative therapy will give way to strengths that will emerge at every step of the therapeutic process. So focusing on the strengths is really important, especially for persons that might be faced with hopelessness or non-compliance. It brings about different aspects of their lives that they do not have anything to do with those problems, such as their skills, talents, and strengths. It also focuses on possible strengths that extends within the family. It might be spiritual or religious kinds of strengths, or high tolerance for stress. So some of these strengths that exist within the family will emerge naturally, but then there are other times when, as the therapist, you have to help to bring out or highlight some of the strengths. So what happens is it puts the problems in a certain perspective, and it can provide a more realistic view of the resources a family brings to the table, and oftentimes strengths that they're not readily aware of. So just as a review of narrative therapy and what it brings to the therapeutic process is that narrative therapy in particular is useful when dealing with trauma and addictions. And it's especially beneficial with these two areas because it separates the individual from the problem. Roth and Epstein believes that narrative therapy is useful in addressing trauma and addiction because it externalizes the problem and counteracts the effects of labeling. And this will aid in no longer seeing the person as the problem, but rather seeing the problem as the problem. So the use of narrative therapy can be used to help map out the effects of addiction, can help them to remember times when an individual was freed from the addiction, can help to remove the stigma of child sexual addictions. It can help the individual explore who they want to be. It can take the blame away from the individual, and it can also help the individual experience themselves as separate from addiction and child sexual abuse. So some of the strengths of narrative therapy is the ability to move clients from passivity and defeatism towards a realization that they already have the power need to bring about a positive solution. It also helps them to avoid blaming, and it separates problems from the individual. And for the clients, this type of therapy, narrative therapy, may not always address the problems because so much focus is on drawing out the strengths. However, language and questioning may be too abstract for some of the clients. It might be over their head. They may not be able to conceptualize exactly what might be meant, and some of the language of psychological, rhetorical overkill might be problematic for certain clients. So basically, we know that with every therapeutic approach, there are some limitations. Narrative therapy is no different. But what I do like about narrative therapy is that it's also very consistent with solution-focused therapy in that it helps the individual, rather than to focus on the problem, to focus on their existing narrative, to retell their narrative or redefine ways of understanding the problem and solving the problem. So I see narrative therapy and solution-focused therapy as very similar. It has very beneficial techniques, especially in today's times where managed care prevail and persons have a limited number of therapeutic sessions. So in a nutshell, we've covered a lot as it relates to both group and family therapy. I know that really you could have an entire class on group therapy as well as family therapy, but I do believe that this class exposes you to a vast amount of information, all of which is very important. The textbooks for this class are extremely beneficial. And so as I have talked about some of these therapeutic approaches, particularly those that are of greatest interest to you, I encourage you to spend time with the chapters of your textbook to become better acquainted with the content. I also encourage you to identify those parts of each of the therapeutic approaches that we've discussed, and there have been many, and identify those parts of the approaches that you like best and incorporate it in your toolbox to best understand effective ways of treating persons with various kinds of disabilities, whether it be from a group context or from a family systems context. So thank you for your attention, and I hope you found this information insightful as well as beneficial.